Hello, everyone. I hope you're doing well. This will be our second lecture in our culture course, which deals with a history of Western philosophy. Now, I am going to divide this lecture into three parts. Part one is going to deal with ancient philosophy. Part two is going to deal with medieval philosophy, and part three is going to deal with modern philosophy. So this part here is going to deal only with the ancient philosophy, which began in 600 BC before Christ and ended at 400 AD after Christ, or Anno Domini. Now, this is these are the different periods, or the different branches of the history of Western philosophy. So it is divided into three different periods, more or less. The first period is the ancient period, so the ancient philosophy, as I said, starting from 600 before Christ until 400 AD. Then we have the second period is the medieval, or the Middle Ages, from 400 AD till the 1600s. And then we have the modern period from the 1600s until the present day. And as I said, in this specific session, this specific video, I'm only going to be focusing on the ancient period, and then I'm going to send you links to other videos, one of them talking about the medieval period and the other talking about the modern period. When we talk about ancient philosophy, you need to know that it is almost entirely Greek. So we're going to deal with a number of Greek philosophers and a number of schools, schools of thought related to the Greeks. And of course, the major philosophers of this period include Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. And of course, the philosophy of these three philosophers influenced all later Western cultures. Even our ideas in all fields of philosophy today originated from them. Anything actually originated from these three Greek philosophers. Before we deal with these three philosophers and specifically deal with Socrates, let me introduce to you people who are called the Pre-Socratics. Pre-Socratics means the ones who came before Socrates, okay? And these people were actually interested in nature, the source of the universe. They wanted to know the source of the universe, and they were also interested in the nature of reality. And if you remember last time when we talked about the nature of reality, we were actually talking about metaphysics. These people wanted to identify the fundamental substance that they thought underlie all phenomena and in terms of which all phenomena could be explained. So again, their aim was to identify the originator, of all these substances, and therefore to identify the source of this universe. They also did not believe that gods or supernatural forces caused natural events. Instead, they sought a natural explanation for natural phenomena, right? More or less what we refer to today as the scientific way of thinking. Okay, so they said, well, we're not going to depend and focus only on supernatural forces or, the gods or more or less in natural causation, but we need to think in a more scientific way. Now, of course, at that time it wasn't called the scientific way of thinking, but more or less a natural explanation for these natural phenomena. The pre-Socratics also tried to find answers for basic philosophical questions. However, their importance does not lie in the answers that they provided, but it actually lies in how they examine the questions in the first place. Now, you're talking about a very, very old period, okay, even before Socrates, right? So the fact that these people started examining these questions in the first place is what would make us, consider them as extremely important. Of course, not because of the results or the answers that they tried to provide, but because of examining these questions in the first place. And of course, the ideas of these pre-Socratics provided a tradition for the rest of the philosophers. The three Greek philosophers I will be introducing in this part are number one, Socrates, and then Plato and Aristotle. Of course, Plato is the student of Socrates, and Aristotle is the student of Plato. It's more of a tree of hierarchy. Let me begin with Socrates. Now, Socrates himself left no writings at all. He was always engaged in philosophic discussion, talking to people, trying to disseminate his ideas in different places. But our knowledge of Socrates' ideas doesn't really come from Socrates himself, but it actually comes from Plato. Plato, actually, his own student, wrote a book. Now you can actually search for it. It's called the Dialogues. And the Dialogues of Plato, you actually see him speaking with his professor, with Socrates. So it's more or less conversations taking place between Socrates and Plato. And in most of these dialogues, Socrates appears as the main character who leads and develops the process of inquiry. Let's know more about Socrates. I'm sure you know a lot about Socrates, but let me just, try to refer to him briefly. He lived in Athens and taught in the streets and in the marketplace. And he tried to define these words. If you have a look at these words, we talked about these words in our first session. And apparently we arrived at no solution whatsoever. You cannot really, I think it's rather impossible to define these words, right? But he wanted to define these words. The word knowledge, the word virtue, the word justice, and the word wisdom. Um, I think it is really very difficult to identify these words. So we have virtue, we have knowledge, justice, and wisdom. Now, how did he, start his method of inquiry, right? He actually taught by what we refer to as a question and answer method, right? So he starts, will ask questions like, what do you mean? How do you know? And this procedure is called the Socratic method, which became the model for philosophic methods that emphasize debate and discussion. So, for instance, if we're going to talk about wisdom, okay, so he's going to ask people this question: what do you mean with, you know, wisdom, right? So the person is going to give a definition for wisdom, whatever, that definition is, depending on the person given that definition. I can have a definition, you can have another definition, right? And then Socrates is going to ask, how do you know? Okay, so this is it. Ask a question about what do you mean by whatever, right? You give your answer, and then he asks again, how do you know? And this procedure is called the Socratic method. Socrates wanted to replace vague opinions with clear ideas. And actually, one of the horrible things that he did, now we see this as horrible because they killed him for that reason, but he really thought he's doing a great job when he questioned important Athenians and exposed their empty claims to knowledge and wisdom, right? And this led him to make a lot of enemies, and this actually that is why he was put to death as a danger to the state. And of course, this is not Aristotle. We are talking about Socrates. Okay, we're not talking about Aristotle here. All right. So Socrates made many enemies and was put to death as a danger to the state. If we move to Plato, now Plato was the student of Socrates, and he believed that we cannot gain knowledge of things through our senses. Okay, so senses are going to deceive you more or less. Okay, and if you want to gain knowledge, it has to be through another way except your own senses. He said that we can have genuine knowledge only of changeless things. And according to him, truth, beauty, and goodness are changeless things. Why? Because as per Plato, he believes that these ideas are only known by the mind. And that is why he called these things ideas or forms. And he maintained that only ideas are real and that all other things only reflect ideas. And this is where, idealism came from, that ideas come first and then matter comes second. The most important idea, according to Plato, is the idea of goodness. According to him, knowledge of good is the object of all inquiry, and the best life is one of contemplation of eternal truth, right? So, the most important thing you do in your life, the most important knowledge that you need to acquire in your life is the knowledge of goodness. And if you want to lead the best life ever, right, the only thing to do is that you contemplate these internal truth. You contemplate on ideas related to truth, related to goodness, and related to knowledge. And he actually stated that people who arrived at this state of mind, which is contemplation of eternal truth should help the rest of the society. So as a philosopher, he actually believed that if you reach, the top, if you reach the zenith of what he really thinks is the most important thing, or the best life, then actually you don't really need to be isolated from the rest of the society, but all you have to do is actually to help people, to help the rest of the society reach that same state. Another major idea of Plato's is the immortality of the soul, right? So he actually believes here that it's only the body that perishes at death, but the soul is immortal. The soul does not die. And of course, his ideas contributed to views about the body, views about the soul, and eternal things that later developed in Christian theology. Now let's move to Aristotle. He was Plato's student. And Aristotle wrote about everything. He was the one who invented the idea of a science and of separate sciences. Now, before Aristotle, it was only one science, which is philosophy. Under philosophy, we have, all the other sciences. But it was Aristotle who actually invented the idea that we have separate sciences, each one having distinct principles and dealing with different subject matter. So he wrote on topics such as physics, astronomy, psychology, biology, physiology, and anatomy. He wrote about actually everything. And he investigated what he called the first philosophy, right? Which later became known as metaphysics. He also created the earliest philosophic system, which he referred to as the overall system. He also believed that all things in nature have purpose. Yes, it reminds us of teleology, which is one branch of metaphysics. According to him, the nature of each thing is determined by its purpose, and all things seek to fulfill their natures by carrying out these purposes. What does that mean? It actually means here that anything in this world and every single person in this world is there for a specific purpose. Perhaps you wouldn't know why you were created when you're too young, but then later on you are going to know that you're created for a reason. You're here for a reason. So for instance, you find yourself you love math very much, so perhaps here your purpose is to be a mathematician. You find yourself so much interested in biology, then later on you actually become a doctor or a physician, right, and help people. So this is actually what he means here, that everything is actually determined by its purpose, and all things seek to fulfill their natures by carrying out these purposes. Aristotle's basic method of inquiry consisted of starting from what we know or think we know, and then asking how, what, and why. Very close to Socrates, who started asking questions. But, for Aristotle here, there is some basic knowledge that we know something, no matter how trivial or no matter how simple. We know something, and then he starts asking questions, more questions about the knowledge that we already have. In his metaphysics, he developed the idea of a first cause, right, which was not itself caused by anything, as the ultimate explanation of existence, right? So you start thinking of yourself, okay, then your parents, and your parents from your grandparents, and grandparents from their grandparents, and so on and so forth, right? Until you actually arrive to the first cause, and of course, he believes here that God is the first cause, and he is the first cause here. Aristotle taught that everyone aims at some good, and that happiness does not lie in pleasure but in virtuous activity, right? And according to him, right, this virtuous activity means that you should be behaving according to the mean between two extremes. I mean, the average, okay? So, for example, we can actually say that courage is the mean between the extremes of cowardice and foolhardiness. Okay, so you're either a coward, or you're actually a person who doesn't really think and just acts very quickly. Okay, and for him, courage is the one in between. It is actually the mean in between these two extremes, and this is according to him, virtuous activity. According to Aristotle, the highest happiness of all is the contemplative use of the mind. What does that mean? The contemplative mind is opened and activated through a wide range of approaches, from pondering to poetry to meditation. So you need to use your mind. How are you going to make your mind so contemplative? By any approach that you feel appropriate, right? Reading poetry, meditate, or whatever. And then this is designed to quiet and shift the habitual chatter of the mind. So you're going, to have a very quiet mind, that is actually ready to receive ideas, that is ready to receive, the highest happiness of all. Okay, in order to cultivate a capacity for deepened awareness, concentration, and insight. Okay, so the highest happiness of all is the contemplative use of the mind. Now, let me introduce four Greek schools of thoughts. The first one is called Epicureanism. The second one is called Stoicism, and actually these two schools are opposites to each other. And then we have skepticism that we talked about before, but here we're going to talk about how it actually originated. And finally, Neoplatonism. Okay, now let me start first of all here by talking about these two different schools, the Epicureanism and the Stoicism, because as I said, they contrast one another. However, there is one major point of intersection here, which is the goal of life is happiness. All right, this is the main idea, the main intersecting point between the two schools. But each school is going to acquire happiness in its own way. Okay, so for Epicureanism, the goal of life is to seek out pleasure and enjoy friends and learning. Okay, so according to Epicureanism, how are you going to feel happy in your life? Actually, by seeking out pleasure and enjoying friends and learning. For Stoicism, again, the goal of life is happiness, but according to them, the goal of life is to know your duty and do the right thing. This is the meaning of happiness for Stoicists. Okay, let me give you more details here. The founder of Stoicism is Zeno of Citium, and this is a nice quotation by him. He says, "The purpose of life is happiness, which is achieved by virtue." Okay, this is how you achieve happiness, for Stoicism. Living according to the dictates of reason, ethical and philosophical training, self reflection, careful judgment, and inner calm. Okay, so this is more or less the method for Stoicists in order to achieve happiness in their lives. So the Stoics believed, as I said, that people should spend their lives trying to cultivate virtue. They also believed in strict determinism. What is the meaning of determinism? Determinism means that you have no control whatsoever, on your life. Okay? And they actually believe that the wise person is the one who accepts and makes the best of what cannot be changed. So you know that you cannot change anything in your life. So a wise person, according to them, is someone who just accepts, his life, and he accepts the fact that he has no control whatsoever on his life. The chief Stoics included Marcus Tullius Cicero, the Emperor Marcus Aurelius, and the teacher Epictetus. As for Epicureanism, all right, the founder is Epicurus, and the school is based on hedonism. What is the meaning of hedonism? Pleasure, more or less. So, as we said, the only good in life is pleasure. They taught that the only good pleasures are calm and moderate because extreme pleasures could lead to pain. So, let me give you an example, for instance. A person who gets a lot of pleasure for perhaps by eating, for instance. Okay, now if you eat, now eventually you might get diseases or something. Okay, so that is why according to them that the only good pleasures are calm and moderate, because extreme pleasures, if you do something that you like too much, this could actually lead to pain. And for them, the highest pleasures are physical health and peace of mind, because according to them, these are two kinds of freedom from pain. Let's move to the third school of thought, which is skepticism. We have already talked about it before. Now, the father of skepticism is someone called Philo of Elis. And according to skepticism, like we talked before, we know nothing. Our senses deceive us. All claims to knowledge are false because we can know nothing. We should treat all things with indifference and make no judgments. Okay, this is how everything started with reference to skepticism, right? We don't know whether this exists or not, and there is nothing we can do in order to, figure out whether this is true or not, because when you depend on your senses actually deceive you, right? And therefore, knowledge is something that we can never know about at all. The fourth school is called Neoplatonism, and as you see here, it comes from Plato himself, and Neo is more or less new. So apparently, this school is based on most of Plato's ideas, and it was originated by Plotinus. Okay, Plotinus was a person who was actually born in Egypt, and he was the person who revived, some ideas by Plato, and that is why Neoplatonism is a revived version of some of Plato's ideas. These people try to guide the individual toward a unity or oneness with God, which is a state of blessedness. And this is very important because this is going to have an influence later on the Christian faith. Okay, because before these people, we didn't really talk about God as much. The focus was on the human being and reason and whatever, but here we're talking about people who really found that, this connection or this oneness with God is one of the best, states a person could find himself in. They also talked about the soul, and he said that our souls yearn for reunion with God, which it can only achieve in mystical experience. Mystical experience, we're talking about something, something close to al-zuhd or something, right? Something very close to Sufi experience, more of, a spiritual, experience. So in order to have good life, then we need to have a reunion with God, right? So it's God who's going to make us have, share this mystical experience. As I said, this philosophy provided a bridge between Greek philosophy and early Christian philosophy. It inspired the idea that important truth can be learned only through faith and God's influence, and not by reason. So if you want to know things about God, you want to understand more about God, you're not going to use your mind anymore. You need to know God through God Himself, right? So you start doing things that God likes. You start, thinking about God from a spiritual perspective until God Himself, guides you to an understanding of who He really is. Okay, so it's God and spirituality that is going to lead you to an understanding, but not